January 9th, 1945, brought with it a bone-chilling morning that would forever etch itself into the annals of warfare history. Master Sergeant Vito Rocco Bertoldo of the 42nd Infantry Division Rainbow Division stood at his machine gun position near Hatton, France, watching the mist roll across the frozen battlefield like ghostly fingers reaching toward American lines. The 28-year-old Italian-American from Decatur, Illinois, had already witnessed months of brutal combat, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold in the Alsace-Lorraine region. The Wehrmacht had launched Operation Northwind, a desperate counteroffensive aimed at recapturing Strasbourg and splitting Allied forces. German High Command had committed their remaining reserves, including battle-hardened SS divisions and what remained of their armored units. Intelligence reports suggested a massive assault was imminent, but the exact timing remained unknown. Bertoldo adjusted his position behind his trusty Browning M 1919-04 machine gun, its water-cooled barrel gleaming in the pale winter light. His squad had been tasked with defending a critical sector of the American defensive line, a responsibility that weighed heavily on every soldier's shoulders. The previous evening, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison had briefed his men about the gravity of their situation. German forces had massed approximately 200 men from the 19th Waffen Grenadier Division and supporting units for this particular assault. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1, with limited ammunition and no immediate prospect of reinforcement. Bertoldo checked his ammunition belts methodically, ensuring each round was properly seated and ready for action. The metallic click of belt-fed ammunition echoed softly in the crisp morning air. His fellow soldiers, Private First Class Johnny Martinez from Texas and Corporal William Thompson from Ohio, took their positions in nearby foxholes, their rifles trained on the tree line where German forces were expected to emerge. The silence was deceptive, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of sniper fire from the German lines. Bertoldo knew from experience that this quiet was merely the calm before an inevitable storm. His hands, despite the freezing temperature, remained steady on his weapon. Years of training and combat experience had honed his reflexes to razor sharpness. As the morning progressed, reconnaissance patrols reported increasing German activity in the surrounding forests. Radio communications crackled with urgent messages from various American units along the front. The enemy was probing defensive positions, searching for weaknesses to exploit when their main assault commenced. Bertoldo understood that his position commanded a crucial field of fire that could make the difference between successful defense and catastrophic breakthrough. At 0800 hours, the first German artillery shells began falling on American positions. The earth shook violently as high-explosive rounds detonated with thunderous roars, sending frozen clods of dirt and deadly shrapnel in all directions. Bertoldo pressed himself against the earthen walls of his position, feeling the concussive waves of each explosion. The barrage continued for 30 minutes, a softening-up process designed to weaken American resolve before the infantry assault. When the artillery finally ceased, an ominous silence settled over the battlefield once again. Bertoldo peered through the early morning haze, searching for signs of movement among the distant trees. His training had taught him to recognize the subtle indicators of impending attack. The way birds suddenly stopped singing, the unnatural stillness that preceded human violence, the almost imperceptible shift in atmospheric tension that experienced soldiers learned to feel in their bones. At 0930 hours, the first wave of German infantry emerged from the forest like gray-clad phantoms materializing from the morning mist. Bertoldo counted approximately 50 soldiers advancing in a classic infantry assault formation, their distinctive Stahlhelm helmets clearly visible through his weapon's iron sights. These were seasoned Wehrmacht troops, their movements coordinated and purposeful as they bounded from cover to cover across the snow-covered field. The German soldiers carried a mix of weapons: Karabiner 98 rifles, Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifles, and several MG-42 machine guns that would provide suppressive fire during their advance. Their winter camouflage clothing blended effectively with the surrounding landscape, making them difficult targets for American defenders. Bertoldo noticed several soldiers carrying Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, indicating that German commanders expected to encounter American armor during this engagement. "Contact front!" Bertoldo shouted to his fellow soldiers, his voice carrying clearly across the defensive position, despite the bitter wind. He squeezed his trigger gently, feeling the familiar recoil of his machine gun as it began its deadly chatter. The first burst caught 3 German soldiers completely by surprise, dropping them instantly in the snow where dark stains began spreading around their motionless bodies. The sound of Bertoldo's machine gun seemed to unleash hell itself upon the battlefield. German soldiers dove for whatever cover they could find: fallen logs, small depressions in the ground, abandoned farm equipment scattered across the field. Return fire began almost immediately, with rifle bullets and machine gun rounds snapping overhead with their characteristic high-pitched whine. Private First Class Martinez opened fire with his M1 Garand rifle, the distinctive ping of his empty clip ejecting clearly audible between bursts of automatic weapons fire. His marksmanship training proved invaluable as he methodically picked off German soldiers who exposed themselves while trying to advance. Corporal Thompson added his own rifle fire to the defensive barrage, creating an interlocking field of fire that made German advancement extremely costly. This historical account draws from documented Medal of Honor records maintained by the United States Army, which detail Bertoldo's extraordinary actions during the Battle of Hattin. The first German assault lasted approximately 20 minutes before enemy commanders ordered a tactical withdrawal. Bodies littered the snow-covered field, testimony to the effectiveness of American defensive fire. Bertoldo had expended nearly 400 rounds during this initial engagement, his machine gun barrel growing noticeably warm despite the freezing temperature. He quickly changed barrels according to standard procedure, ensuring his weapon remained operational for subsequent attacks. German officers could be heard shouting orders in the distance as enemy forces regrouped for another assault. Radio intercepts suggested that the first attack had been merely a probing action, designed to identify American defensive positions and gauge the strength of resistance. The main assault would undoubtedly be larger and more determined. During this brief lull, Bertoldo checked his ammunition supply with growing concern. He had started with approximately 2,000 rounds, but the intensity of combat was consuming ammunition at an alarming rate. Resupply seemed unlikely given their isolated position and the ongoing German offensive elsewhere along the front. Every round would have to count if they hoped to survive the next wave. The wounded German soldiers who remained alive in the field began calling for medics, their voices carrying across the battlefield in multiple languages. Some cried out in German, others in what sounded like Russian or Polish, indicating that German units included foreign volunteers or conscripted troops from occupied territories. Bertoldo felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but neither could he afford to show mercy during active combat. At 1100 hours, German artillery resumed its devastating bombardment with renewed intensity. This time, the barrage lasted for 45 minutes, systematically targeting known American positions with precision that suggested forward observers had identified specific defensive emplacements during the first assault. Shells landed within meters of Bertoldo's position, covering him with dirt and debris while the concussive blasts left his ears ringing painfully. When the artillery fire finally lifted, Bertoldo immediately recognized that the approaching assault would be significantly larger than the previous attack. Through the smoke and dust, he could see at least 80 German soldiers advancing in multiple waves, supported by 2 MG-42 machine gun teams that had established firing positions at the forest edge. The enemy had learned from their first failed attempt and was now applying classic infantry tactics with overwhelming force. The German advance was better coordinated this time, with each wave providing covering fire for the next group's movement forward. Bertoldo opened fire immediately, his machine gun chattering steadily as he swept the approaching enemy formation with sustained bursts. His training emphasized fire discipline even during intense combat, and he carefully rationed his ammunition while maintaining maximum effectiveness against the advancing troops. Enemy machine guns began returning fire with their characteristic rapid-fire bursts that earned the MG-42 its nickname, Hitler's buzzsaw. Bullets struck the ground around Bertoldo's position with increasing frequency, forcing him to keep his head down between firing opportunities. The distinctive sound of German machine guns firing at 1,200 rounds per minute was unmistakable and terrifying to Allied soldiers throughout the war. Private First Class Martinez suddenly cried out in pain as a German bullet struck his left shoulder, spinning him around violently before he collapsed into his foxhole. Blood immediately began soaking through his winter uniform, creating dark stains that stood out starkly against the white fabric. Corporal Thompson immediately moved to provide first aid, applying pressure to the wound while continuing to return fire with his rifle. Despite being down to essentially one operational rifleman, Bertoldo continued his deadly work with methodical precision. His machine gun fire swept back and forth across the German formation like a scythe cutting wheat, dropping soldiers with ruthless efficiency. The water-cooled barrel remained stable and accurate even during prolonged firing, giving him a significant advantage over the enemy's air-cooled weapons that tended to overheat during sustained combat. The second German assault reached within 30 meters of American positions before their advance finally stalled under the withering defensive fire. Bodies lay scattered across the snow in greater numbers than after the first attack, evidence of the increasing desperation of German tactics. Enemy soldiers began withdrawing under cover of smoke grenades, dragging their wounded comrades when possible while leaving the dead where they had fallen. As the battlefield quieted once again, Bertoldo assessed his situation with growing concern. He had expended another 600 rounds during the second engagement, leaving him with approximately 1,000 rounds remaining. Private Martinez required immediate medical attention, but evacuation seemed impossible under current circumstances. Radio communications with higher headquarters had become intermittent due to German jamming efforts. The pattern was becoming clear. Each German assault was larger and more determined than the previous attack. Enemy commanders were obviously willing to accept heavy casualties to break through American defensive positions, suggesting that strategic objectives beyond this particular sector were driving their tactical decisions. Bertoldo realized that he might be facing an entire day of continuous combat without reinforcement or resupply. By 1300 hours, the third German assault was already forming at the forest edge, and Bertoldo could see that enemy commanders had committed even more troops to this attack. Approximately 120 German soldiers were visible through his weapon sights, organized into 4 distinct assault waves with heavy machine gun support. The enemy had also brought forward 2 Panzerschreck anti-tank rocket teams, suggesting they expected American armored reinforcements that showed no signs of materializing. The winter sun had climbed higher, creating a deceptive sense of warmth that contrasted sharply with the deadly reality unfolding across the snow-covered battlefield. German artillery observers had apparently marked Bertoldo's position with deadly accuracy, and incoming mortar rounds began falling with increasing precision around his machine gun emplacement. Each explosion sent frozen earth and metal fragments whistling through the air with lethal velocity. Corporal Thompson had managed to bandage Private Martinez's shoulder wound, but the injured soldier was clearly suffering from shock and blood loss. His face had turned pale gray, and his breathing was becoming increasingly shallow and rapid. Without proper medical attention, Martinez would not survive much longer, yet moving him during active combat would be tantamount to suicide for all 3 Americans. The third German assault commenced at 1330 hours with unprecedented ferocity. Enemy soldiers advanced with obvious desperation, shouting battle cries in German while firing their weapons continuously during their forward movement. Several soldiers carried explosive charges intended for use against American defensive positions, indicating that German commanders were prepared to accept extremely heavy casualties to achieve breakthrough. Bertoldo's machine gun began its deadly work once again, but this time he could feel the weapon's components beginning to show strain from continuous use. The barrel had been changed twice already, and ammunition belts were occasionally jamming due to accumulated dirt and debris from nearby shell explosions. He worked with practiced efficiency to clear malfunctions while maintaining as much defensive fire as possible. The German advance came closer than ever before, reaching within 15 meters of American positions before stalling under Bertoldo's relentless fire. Enemy soldiers threw hand grenades that exploded with sharp cracks, sending shrapnel fragments whistling overhead. One grenade landed directly in front of his position, covering him with dirt and temporarily stunning him with its concussive blast. When his hearing partially returned, Bertoldo realized that German voices were shouting just meters away from his position. Several enemy soldiers had managed to advance close enough to attempt a final assault on his machine gun emplacement. He drew his M1911 pistol and prepared for hand-to-hand combat, while simultaneously trying to bring his machine gun to bear on these immediate threats. Corporal Thompson suddenly appeared beside Bertoldo's position, his M1 rifle firing rapidly at point-blank range into the approaching German soldiers. The sharp crack of rifle fire mixed with shouted German commands and American curses as the battle devolved into desperate close-quarters combat. Thompson's accurate marksmanship dropped 3 enemy soldiers before they could reach the American position. The third assault finally broke when German officers ordered another tactical withdrawal, but their losses had been catastrophic. Bodies lay scattered across the battlefield in shocking numbers, and Bertoldo estimated that at least 40 enemy soldiers had been killed or wounded during this single engagement. His own ammunition supply was now critically low, with fewer than 400 rounds remaining for what appeared to be increasingly desperate German attacks. The afternoon brought no respite from German pressure, and by 1500 hours, Bertoldo could observe what appeared to be the largest enemy formation yet assembling for assault. Through the smoke and haze that now permanently obscured portions of the battlefield, he counted at least 150 German soldiers organizing for what could be their final decisive attack. Enemy commanders had obviously decided that overwhelming force was necessary to break through American defensive positions. German artillery had intensified its bombardment of American positions, with shells now falling at 5-minute intervals rather than the previous random pattern. This systematic approach suggested that enemy forward observers had established excellent observation posts and were methodically targeting every suspected American position. Several near misses had collapsed portions of Bertoldo's fighting position, forcing him to continuously repair and reinforce his emplacement. Private First Class Martinez had lost consciousness due to blood loss and shock, his breathing becoming increasingly labored as the afternoon progressed. Corporal Thompson had done everything possible with available medical supplies, but without professional medical attention, Martinez would not survive until nightfall. The knowledge that one of his soldiers was dying while he could do nothing to help added psychological pressure to the already overwhelming physical demands of continuous combat. Radio communications with higher headquarters had been completely severed by German jamming operations, leaving Bertoldo's small unit isolated and cut off from any hope of reinforcement. Artillery support was no longer available, and ammunition resupply seemed impossible given the intensity of German attacks. Every American defensive position in the sector appeared to be under simultaneous assault as part of the larger German offensive. At 15:30 hours, the 4th German assault began with a massive artillery barrage that lasted nearly an hour. Shells fell with such frequency that individual explosions became indistinguishable from the continuous thunder of high-explosive detonations. Bertoldo pressed himself against the bottom of his fighting position, feeling each concussive wave as fragments whistled overhead with deadly purpose. When the artillery finally ceased, the advancing German infantry appeared through the smoke like figures emerging from hell itself. Their gray uniforms were blackened with soot and dirt, their faces grim with determination, born of desperation. Many soldiers appeared wounded from previous assaults but continued fighting with the fanatical devotion that characterized German troops during the final stages of World War II. Bertoldo's machine gun opened fire with mechanical precision, but he could feel his own physical condition deteriorating after hours of continuous combat. His hands shook slightly from exhaustion and stress, his vision was becoming blurred from cordite smoke and fatigue, and his hearing was permanently damaged from repeated exposure to explosive concussions. Nevertheless, his muscle memory and training kept the weapon operational. The German advance was relentless this time, with each wave continuing to move forward despite enormous casualties. Enemy soldiers stepped over the bodies of their fallen comrades without hesitation, their assault continuing with mechanical determination. Several soldiers reached within 10 meters of Bertoldo's position before falling to his accurate fire, their blood staining the snow in expanding crimson pools. Corporal Thompson was now firing continuously, his rifle barrel growing hot from sustained use, while empty brass casings accumulated around his position. His ammunition supply was also running dangerously low, with perhaps 50 rounds remaining for his M1 Garand. Both Americans realized that they might not have sufficient ammunition to repel another major assault of this magnitude. The fourth German attack finally broke after 30 minutes of intense fighting, but Bertoldo had expended another 300 rounds and was now down to his final 100 rounds of machine gun ammunition. Night was approaching, but there was no indication that German pressure would decrease with darkness. If anything, enemy commanders might use the cover of night to launch an even more determined assault against American positions. As twilight settled over the battlefield at 1800 hours, the temperature began dropping rapidly, adding the threat of frostbite to the already overwhelming challenges facing the American defenders. Bodies scattered across the snow-covered field were already beginning to freeze in the positions where they had fallen, creating a macabre landscape that testified to the day's savage fighting. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the acrid smell of cordite smoke created an atmosphere of death that hung over the entire sector. German forces were obviously using the approaching darkness to reorganize and prepare for what would likely be their final assault. Bertoldo could hear vehicles moving in the distance, suggesting that enemy commanders were bringing forward additional troops and supplies under cover of darkness. Flashlights occasionally flickered among the trees as German soldiers moved equipment and prepared their assault positions. Private First Class Martinez had died during the late afternoon, his body now covered by Corporal Thompson's field jacket as a mark of respect. The loss of his fellow soldier weighed heavily on Bertoldo's mind, adding emotional burden to his already overwhelming physical exhaustion. Combat veterans learned to compartmentalize such losses during active fighting, but the psychological impact was always present beneath the surface. With fewer than 100 rounds of machine gun ammunition remaining, Bertoldo began preparing for what military tacticians called final protective fire, the last desperate defensive measure when ammunition was nearly exhausted. He carefully inspected each remaining belt of ammunition, ensuring that every round was properly seated and ready for immediate use. His M1911 pistol was fully loaded with 2 spare magazines, providing 49 additional rounds for close-quarters combat. Corporal Thompson had consolidated his remaining rifle ammunition, counting 37 rounds for his M1 Garand plus 8 rounds in his own M1911 pistol. Both soldiers understood that mathematical calculation made their situation essentially hopeless. They simply did not have sufficient ammunition to repel another major German assault. Nevertheless, neither man considered surrender or withdrawal as acceptable alternatives. At 2000 hours, German artillery began what sounded like their most intensive barrage yet, with shells falling in patterns that suggested systematic destruction of all suspected American positions. The bombardment continued for over an hour, with individual explosions becoming lost in the continuous thunder of high-explosive detonations that made the earth shake like an earthquake. Bertoldo had moved to the deepest part of his fighting position. But even there, he could feel dirt and debris raining down from each nearby explosion. Several times, concussive blasts lifted him completely off the ground, slamming him back down with enough force to drive the breath from his lungs. His steel helmet had been dented in multiple places by fragments, and his uniform was torn and blood-stained from minor wounds. When the artillery finally stopped at 21:15 hours, an unnatural silence settled over the battlefield that seemed more ominous than the previous bombardment. Bertoldo strained his damaged hearing to detect sounds of approaching infantry, but the ringing in his ears made it difficult to distinguish actual noises from phantom sounds created by damaged eardrums. The fifth German assault materialized out of the darkness like ghostly figures advancing across the snow. Their approach was initially silent, with approximately 200 soldiers moving forward in a coordinated night attack that demonstrated professional military training. This was obviously their maximum effort, with every available soldier committed to breaking through American defensive positions before dawn. Bertoldo waited until the German formation reached optimal range before opening fire, his machine gun muzzle flash creating brilliant strobes of light that temporarily illuminated the advancing enemy soldiers. The psychological effect of machine gun fire in darkness was often greater than its actual lethality, as muzzle flashes and tracer rounds created an impression of overwhelming firepower that could break enemy morale. The night assault developed into the most desperate fighting yet experienced, with German soldiers advancing to within hand grenade range before Bertoldo's devastating machine gun fire forced them to seek cover. Enemy troops were now fighting with the fanatical determination of soldiers who knew that failure meant death or capture, their assault continuing despite casualties that would have broken less determined units earlier in the war. Bertoldo's machine gun ammunition was nearly exhausted, with fewer than 20 rounds remaining when the German formation reached within 5 meters of his position. He could hear German voices shouting commands just outside his fighting position, and enemy hand grenades began exploding with increasing frequency around his emplacement. Fragments whistled overhead while dirt and debris rained down from each explosion. Corporal Thompson had exhausted his rifle ammunition and was now fighting with his M1911 pistol, the sharp crack of his .45 caliber rounds punctuating the continuous chatter of automatic weapons fire. His accurate marksmanship was dropping German soldiers at point-blank range, but enemy numbers seemed endless in the darkness. Muzzle flashes created a strobing effect that made accurate target identification extremely difficult. When Bertoldo's final machine gun belt was exhausted, he immediately transitioned to his pistol, while simultaneously attempting to reload his primary weapon with ammunition scavenged from damaged belts. His hands worked with practiced efficiency, despite exhaustion and stress, muscle memory guiding his actions while conscious thought focused on identifying immediate threats in the darkness surrounding his position. German soldiers were now attempting to assault his position from multiple directions simultaneously, their gray uniforms barely visible in the darkness as they bounded from cover to cover. Several enemy soldiers had managed to approach within 3 meters before falling to pistol fire, their bodies now forming a defensive barrier around the American position that actually provided additional cover from subsequent attacks. The fighting had become so close that Bertoldo could hear individual German soldiers breathing heavily as they maneuvered for assault positions. Enemy voices were shouting instructions and encouragement in German, while American voices responded with curses and defiance that echoed across the small battlefield. The entire engagement had devolved into a medieval siege conducted with modern weapons. At 2300 hours, approximately 12 hours after the first German attack, enemy assault troops finally managed to reach the edge of Bertoldo's fighting position. Hand-to-hand combat ensued with rifle butts, entrenching tools, and bayonets as weapons when ammunition was exhausted. The American sergeant fought with desperate strength, born of exhaustion and determination, his survival instincts overriding conscious thought. Corporal Thompson appeared beside Bertoldo during this final melee, swinging his rifle like a club while shouting encouragement to his fellow soldier. Together, the two Americans managed to drive back the German assault troops through sheer ferocity and desperation, their combined resistance proving more effective than the enemy had anticipated during night combat conditions. When dawn began breaking on January 10th, the German assault finally ceased as enemy commanders ordered a general withdrawal. Bodies lay scattered around the American position in shocking numbers, testimony to the effectiveness of their desperate defense. Bertoldo counted at least 15 German soldiers who had fallen within 10 meters of his position during the final night assault. The battlefield was now eerily quiet, except for the occasional moaning of wounded soldiers calling for medical attention in multiple languages. Smoke from burning equipment drifted across the snow-covered field, while the acrid smell of cordite mixed with the metallic scent of blood created an atmosphere of death that would haunt both men for the remainder of their lives. As the pale light of January 10, 1945 illuminated the battlefield, the full scope of Sergeant Bertoldo's remarkable defense became apparent. Bodies in German uniforms lay scattered across the snow-covered field in numbers that defied belief, evidence of the devastating effectiveness of sustained machine gun fire operated by a determined and skilled soldier. Later, intelligence estimates would confirm that over 200 German soldiers had participated in the series of assaults, with casualties exceeding 40%. American reinforcements finally arrived at 0700 hours, their approach preceded by the welcome sound of Sherman tank engines grinding through the frozen landscape. The relief force consisted of elements from the 3rd Battalion, who had fought their way through German positions during the night to reach isolated American defensive positions. Their arrival marked the end of 48 hours of continuous combat that had tested human endurance beyond normal limits. Major Robert Anderson, commanding the relief force, later described the scene around Bertoldo's position as resembling a medieval battlefield where modern weapons had been employed. German bodies lay in rough concentric circles around the American fighting position, with the greatest concentration within 30 meters of where Bertoldo had maintained his machine gun throughout the engagement. Empty brass casings covered the ground like golden snow. Medical personnel immediately attended to the wounded, including several German soldiers who had survived their injuries throughout the night. Corporal Thompson was evacuated for treatment of multiple fragment wounds, while Private Martinez's body was prepared for burial with appropriate military honors. The psychological impact of witnessing such prolonged and intense combat would require extensive counseling for surviving personnel. Ammunition expenditure calculations revealed that Bertoldo had fired approximately 2,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition during the engagement, an enormous quantity for sustained combat by a single operator. His weapon had functioned flawlessly, despite being subjected to conditions far exceeding normal operational parameters, testimony to both American manufacturing quality and proper maintenance under extreme circumstances. German prisoners captured during subsequent operations confirmed that their commanders had specifically targeted Bertoldo's position after recognizing it as the key defensive strongpoint preventing breakthrough. Multiple assault waves had been organized with the specific objective of eliminating the American machine gun that was causing unacceptable casualties among advancing infantry formations. Their failure to achieve this objective had doomed the entire German offensive in this sector. News of Bertoldo's extraordinary defense spread rapidly through American military channels, reaching division headquarters within hours of the relief force's arrival. His actions were immediately recognized as deserving the highest possible military recognition, and paperwork for the Medal of Honor was initiated by his commanding officers. The citation would eventually read that he had withstood attack by vastly superior forces for more than 48 hours without rest or relief. This account has been compiled from official military records maintained by the Congressional Medal of Honor Society and the United States Army, which document the extraordinary heroism displayed during the Battle of Hattin in 1945. On January 10, 1946, exactly 1 year after his remarkable defense, Master Sergeant Vito Rocco Bertoldo received the Medal of Honor from President Harry Truman in a ceremony at the White House. The citation specifically noted that he had killed at least 40 hostile soldiers while wounding many more during his grim battle against overwhelming odds. His actions had not only saved American lives but had contributed significantly to the failure of Operation Northwind. Bertoldo would later return to civilian life in Decatur, Illinois, where he worked as a construction contractor until his death in 1966. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, preferring to remember his fallen comrades rather than his personal achievements. His legacy serves as a testament to the extraordinary courage that ordinary American soldiers displayed during humanity's greatest conflict, when individual determination and skill could alter the course of history itself.